America, we are in a new world, a world where these words don't even make a difference anymore. This is the health care bill. This is the beginning. This is only the first 500 pages of the new financial bill. That one is about 2,400 pages as well. These bills are a chain around the neck of our country, and we are about to have all of these bills just chained to us and thrown into the river. We have already created an environment where no one wants to do business. It's common sense. Companies need to increase their bottom line. We don't know how to do business. Anything that raises the cost of doing business in America, this is what happened in the 70s. Unions, taxes, regulations, everything else. We couldn't do business anymore. Manufacturing went away. So our backup plan, don't relax. Don't just, please, it's fine. We're not going to make stuff anymore. We're going to be the financial capital of the world. We'll just produce the world's paper. Well, now with this bill, we're chasing the paper out as well. Who gives us credibility on anything because we don't have character? In this bill also, farms. Farmers don't want this bill because of a derivatives measure. It will make it too expensive for them to hedge against the volatility of crop and fuel prices. Now, what does that mean? Well, what happens if our fuel prices necessarily skyrocket? What happens to the farmer? Farmers are saying this is going to kill the farm. You know, we're not the world's breadbasket anymore already. What happens if we kill the American farmer? Gee, you think food might be in short supply? Gee, you think food prices will necessarily skyrocket? I ask you again, imagine a world where you can trust a man. You know, Woodrow Wilson, a guy who is the worst president this country has ever had, he hated America. I read everything I could about Woodrow Wilson, and in some of the books that I read, I found in his life, he read one book like 3 or 4 times during his administration. It was called Philip Drew, Administrator. It's one of the worst novels ever written. I got it because I wanted to see what he was thinking. It was written about Philip Drew. It's a novel, and Philip was a guy who, well, he was living in a time where nobody trusted anybody. You couldn't trust the newspapers. You couldn't trust the president. You couldn't trust business. You couldn't trust Congress. Everybody was corrupt. And the hero, Philip Drew, well, he didn't want to, but he headed to Washington where he could save the day. He goes to change Washington. He doesn't want to be called the president or anything else. He wants to be called an administrator. An administrator, because he would use, they didn't call him this in the book, but czars. He would use administrators to work out all the details, exactly like these bills. They were government officials, but they weren't the elected, because the elected, I mean, they're greedy, they're selfish, they're trying to get elected, but administrators, they're clean. They can fix the problem. And in the end, Philip Drew sent his administrators state by state to fix every state and their constitutions, because their constitutions, well, were outdated, and their constitutions couldn't help the flow of things. It was so very great. Sound familiar? He didn't want to be called the president. He wanted to be called an administrator. Today, we would know him as a dictator. In fact, in 1932, Colonel House wrote an article in the New York Times saying, does America need a dictator? He's the guy who begged FDR, just become a dictator, just take it. It's better, you know. The future is really just a reflection of the past. You've heard Obama say this was the largest legislation of the financial work since FDR. He's right. But let's look at what that means. How did that work out for FDR? Because they tried this in the 1930s. FDR first created the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. Farmers were struggling, and, he said, hey, we got a whole bunch of socialist administrators here who know how this capitalism thing works. Supply and demand, right? Too much supply. Let's increase the value of your crops and animals by slaughtering them and destroying your crops. For example, they destroyed over 6 million pigs, plowed under 10 million acres of cotton, and paid the farmers for the first time in man's history not to produce. The result? Food lines. There was no food. Because the administrators, they knew best. They just got it slightly wrong this time. Then they decided they were going to use price controls because there was deflation ahead. Remember that, deflation ahead. FDR had the National Recovery Administration. They controlled the costs. They controlled the prices. You going to dry clean a shirt? You cannot charge less than this amount. Deflation. They would stop it artificially. Salaries, everything spiraled out of control. Money was in short supply because businesses, they tightened their belt and held on and battened down the hatches because the people in Washington are insane. How do you do business in this atmosphere? It's so funny because I talked to a business leader, yesterday or the day before. He's got 15,000 square feet of office space in a brand new New York high-rise here in New York City. 15,000 square feet. Do you know how much that costs per foot? He said it's sitting empty, and I said, why? Is business bad? And he said, no, business is okay. But it makes more sense for me to eat the money in that rent until I figure out what this city is going to do and what Obama is going to do to business, because if they crush me in taxes, I can't be sitting here with a 15,000 square foot floor with filled with employees. I can't hire anybody. I don't know if I'll have the money to keep them employed. Businesses are like banks right now. They are flush with money, but are they loaning it? Are they spending it? No. You know why? Because they don't know what's coming. Now, Verizon and GE, Mort Zuckerman even said just the other day, we can't predict how to do business in this atmosphere. We don't know what to do. Really? It couldn't happen to a bunch of nicer people. Really? You were in bed with them, and now you say you don't know how you're going to do business. Isn't that interesting? Well, you know what FDR did? FDR, after his businesses started to say things like this, he decided that businesses were hoarding their wealth and using their power to monopolize industry. So in 1935, he said, I got new taxes known as the Soak the Rich tax. He enacted the most egregious tax in the end, a tax on all what he called undistributed profits. So in other words, you couldn't save for a rainy day. Businesses begged him, Mr. Roosevelt, please don't do this. Companies argued that they needed that money in case of a rainy day. He said, you're hoarding money. He passed it. But FDR didn't care if it was bad for business. This is one of his cronies. This is Raymond Moley, who was with him for a long time, helped him design the New Deal and everything else until he figured out what the heck was going on. He said, what are you doing to businesses? As for bankers and businessmen, he wholeheartedly said that he welcomed their hatred. Every time they made an attack on him, he gained votes. Well, he gained votes, but what happened to the country? He said the worst was behind us. 1936, they passed this. 1937 through the March of 1938, the market crashed, losing 49% of its value, and no one had anything left for a rainy day. Imagine what could happen. Back.